Okay, welcome to Life Science Cafe. My name is Sonia Glasser. I am a PhD student in the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology program at UMass Amherst, and I will be the MC for tonight's cafe. Established in 2011, Life Science Cafe is organized by graduate student researchers at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Each month, we invite experts to share and discuss the research. Typically, we host these events in the Amherst community, but we are continuing our efforts virtually. We would like to thank our funders, the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology program, the Graduate Student Senate, and the Graduate School at UMass, the National Science Foundation, and our generous UMass Gives donors. Subscribe to our mailing list and stay tuned for future cafes. Okay, so, well, today we are very excited to have Dr. Eve Beaury with us here to talk about her work using big data to understand climate change, invasive species, and other drivers of global biodiversity loss. Dr. Beaury is a UMass Organismic and Evolutionary Biology alumna and was very active in various UMass outreach initiatives and activities, including co-organizing our very own Life Science Cafe for the last 5 years. Currently, Eve is a postdoctoral research associate in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology in Princeton University. As a Life Science Cafe alumna, we are very excited to have her back and hear about her current work. Thank you for joining us, Eve.
Thank you for having me. It's weird being on the other side of the MC spectrum, but yeah, thanks. It's nice to be back with this group.
I bet. Well, it seems like you work with a lot of big picture issues, all of which are kind of encompassed within the phenomenon of global change, which arguably is the largest picture issue, right? So I think kind of, maybe our audience is familiar with climate change, but maybe global change could be a new term for everyone. Do you mind describing global change and what are the main drivers of global change?
Yeah, of course. And I guess, yeah, I'll just say I'm trying to market myself as a global change ecologist in big data science. I think that's the direction that I'm headed in, but anything could change. But global change is basically just an umbrella term for anything that causes a change to the Earth system. So climate change is obviously the hot topic everybody's talking about right now, but there are lots of other drivers of global change like land use change, the spread of invasive species, diseases, changes to nutrient and water cycling, species movement, all kinds of stuff. And I think often we talk about global change drivers as a negative thing. So things that are negatively impacting our native biodiversity, which I can get into a little bit as we go, which is kind of the lens that I'm coming from and what I'm most interested in, which is kind of these negative impacts to our Earth system as a function of these different changes, primarily caused by humans. But in general, global change is just a change to the Earth's system that happens for all kinds of different reasons.
Thank you. Which encompasses those drivers, one of them being climate change.
Yeah, so climate change is just one form of global change. And global change is kind of a broader term.
Perfect. I think you can market yourself as a global change.
We're working on it.
Yeah. So how do you study global change in your work? It seems like a pretty big thing to study. Like what type of data are you collecting or using?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, I just finished my PhD at UMass, where my focus was largely on the spread of invasive species and their interactions with climate change. And I thought about those topics from the lens of biogeography and spatial ecology, which basically just means I'm interested in understanding how biodiversity is distributed across space, and how we can use that information, that spatial understanding and that spatial information to try to make more informed decisions about how we manage ecological systems and invasive species and climate change and all of those kinds of things. So it's kind of a big picture view on where species are and why they're there and what impact they're having on one another. And so a lot of the data that I use or have used in the past has been previously collected by other people and compiled into large data sets or captured through satellite imagery, big spatial data sets and things like that. So I don't spend any time in the field or lab anymore. I'm all computer-based. pretty much leveraging resources that we already have and that other people have put in a ton of work to collect and compile. And kind of one of the goals of biogeography is to take those existing resources and data sets and try to see what patterns we can see across different ecosystems and different species and habitat types and things like that. So really, like I said, taking this kind of broad stroke view, using as much data as we can to try to look for broad continental or global scale patterns. So I think
and
that,
so
yeah.
that sort of data, would you call that big data?
Yeah,
would that be
I would
the
call
big
it
data we're referring to?
big data, meaning just a lot of data over broad spatial scales. I think it's becoming like a flashy term in a lot of fields, but especially in ecology right now. There's this major push to try to make data really accessible. So any data anybody is collecting, even if it's at one, field site at one place, to try to make that data available and accessible to other people so that scientists like the kind of work that I do can take that and put it together and look for those more general patterns. So yeah, we call it big data. There's I guess they call it the big data revolution that's kind of currently happening. And that means a lot of different things in terms of how much data we're collecting about different things and where we're putting it and putting it together. And so I think it's really exciting because this work wasn't previously possible when we were really focused on individual sites or lab studies, but because we have so much more computing resources and data repositories, and again, this kind of cultural shift to throwing everything out there and letting other people use it, I think it's opening up a lot of doors for us to ask really broad ecological questions and ask what is replicated across space from individual field experiments and what's not. So what's not actually seen in nature that we see in experimental settings, and what can we learn from that when we're trying to make big kind of management and policy decisions, especially with things like invasive species and climate change, which are such big kind of broad problems. And like I mentioned earlier, the reason we care about this is because we're seeing major declines in native biodiversity across the entire globe. And so, individual efforts to save species or habitat types are really important, but these changes are happening at a scale that requires us to think really big and really broad and use a lot of data to try to make substantiated decisions. And so that's kind of where I get excited about doing this kind of work and why I'm interested in it. It's thinking really big and broadly about science and ecology.
Well, I'm appreciative. As a field ecologist, I have a hard enough time wrangling my own data set, which is much smaller than what you're working with. So I can't imagine. Sounds like a pretty big deal.
Well, there's trade-offs, of course. So it's comes at the cost of not, thinking big is really great, but we need, the smaller scale stuff, or else we have really no idea what's going on.
The details are important. The details are important, but there's definitely great value in being able to kind of find broad patterns and try to solve big problems, right?
I would agree.
So I kind of want to start us off chronologically with this first portion, with this first part of our conversation, and kind of go into your invasive species work, the work you did during your PhD. Would you start us off with a definition?
Yeah.
What is an invasive species?
Yeah, so when my lab group at UMass thinks about invasive species, and I think this is becoming the most common definition, is we're thinking about something that's non-native, which means it's been moved to an area outside of where it originally evolved, typically because people have moved it there. So it's no longer in its kind of native evolutionary history range. So it's showing up in a new place. It has this ability to really spread rapidly for all kinds of different reasons. And then typically we define an invasive species as one that has an impact on the ecosystem that it shows up in. So there are lots of non-native species that have spread all across the world. And then, of that pool of non-native species, we consider the invasives to be the ones that are really reaching high densities and causing some change in the ecological systems that they're showing up in. And typically that's a negative change that we're seeing.
Definitely. And how are invasive species moving? How do they get to where they are?
Oh yeah, and we have slides.
You have slides.
Yeah, so we have slides. Yeah, let me share my slides because I have a good
Hold on, folks. We have some images.
Yeah, let me see how to do this. Sorry, I had two screens open, so give me a second.
Take your time.
This is one of my favorite slides.
Yeah.
Because it has my dog on it.
Oh,
Which some people in the audience will probably recognize this from my defense, but yeah, so there's a ton of ways that people are moving species around the earth. Maybe I have another, let me see. You can see this okay?
I can see it fine.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is just an example from one study that came out in 2013 that my advisor at UMass worked on, that's plant specifically, but I think speaks to a lot of other invasive taxa. And so they basically figured out how all the invasive plants in the United States were originally introduced. For about 30% of those species, we don't actually know. So there's no documentation, no historical catalogs or anything about how it showed up. About 10% were introduced accidentally. So that was often through things like kind of like what you see on this slide, like sticking to boats and shoes or travelers, cargo, stowaways, animal transport, but that's, you know, at a finer scale, which this is what you can see. These are seeds stuck to my dog's harness right there.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but I think the main thing is these kind of stowaways on shipments of products where you might have some plant matter sneak in accidentally. So those are the accidental transports. And like this is a good one example too of invasive species are really good at sticking to things. So that's about 10% of the species that we have, but the vast majority of invasive species are introduced to new areas intentionally. Sometimes those introductions are well-intentioned. So there is a history of some conservation accidents where we brought species to new areas thinking they're going to be like really good agricultural products, or they're going to be biocontrol for something else we don't want around. And they've been able to spread rapidly. And so there are some like accidental conservation mistakes that we've made that accounts for some of that. But for plants specifically, and for invasive insects as well, the vast majority of species are being brought or shipped to new areas through the horticultural industry, which is what this little image down here is showing. So it's something crazy now that like almost 70% of the world's plant flora are being moved to new areas for some kind of commercial human-based reason, like medicine, agriculture, gardening, horticulture, stuff like that. And so this is a huge global market. And unfortunately, one of the like negative consequences of that is the introduction of non-native plants that then escape cultivation and become invasive. And then also the introduction of invasive insects. So tons of invasive insects come over in accidental shipments. So things like cargo ships or like all kinds of product stuff, but their main transport vector is also plants. So insects that are kind of hitchhiking on non-native plant imports to new countries, and then are able to spread into natural areas and become invasive. So I would say the horticulture industry is the one that I know the most about, and also is the most common one that we think about for invasive plants and insects. And then animals, it's kind of analogous. It's the pet trade is actually the number one distributor. So this group might actually probably would be familiar with invasive snakes in Florida. So pythons have really spread and become invasive in the Everglades, and they're just wrecking everything. They're a predator that pretty much eats any rodent or animal that's smaller than them. There's some crazy photos of the pythons eating deer and even other alligators and stuff, and there's nothing that eats the snakes. And so they're just able to like spread like crazy. And that invasion started because enough pet owners who bought a python and thought it'd be really cool to have a big snake couldn't take care of it. And instead of taking it back to the pet store, released it in their backyard or in a swamp or a stream. And that
I wish you had some pictures of that.
Yeah, that's shockingly common. There's also red-eared sliders are an invasive turtle that's really common in the mid-Atlantic. It's the same thing. That's like a really common pet store turtle that has been released. And so, yeah, those kind of commercial industries are unintentionally leading to a lot of invasions.
So I guess to kind of finish off this invasive species topic, kind of focusing back on plants, in your opinion, Dr. Beaury, can you plant an invasive species responsibly?
No, I don't think so, no. And so again, there's a big difference between a non-native plant in general and an invasive plant. if we abandon all non-native plants, we would lose like 70% of the horticultural industry's current product. And so like expecting that to happen is kind of ridiculous. But there are, like, we know enough about when things are becoming invasive that we have a good sense for, you know, what traits are a little bit trickier, what species are coming from different countries. And so we have an idea of what we shouldn't be planting and importing. And so it just, to me, this is like a crazy issue. So, okay, so some of my research has found that 61% of America's invasive plants are still being marketed as garden plants. So more than half of the plants that we already have here, we know are invasive, we know have negative impacts, are still being marketed as garden plants somewhere in the US. And that's just crazy because we have so many good alternatives, including like benign non-natives and also native alternative plants that are actually good for the environment instead of like potentially really risky and can spread and have these negative impacts. That it seems crazy to me that people are still really passionate and pushing for planting invasives, but that's like a huge industry problem. And that, you know, once something is really common in the market, so something that people might be familiar with in the Northeast in Massachusetts is burning bush. That's an ornamental shrub. Burning bush and Japanese barberry are everywhere, all through Amherst, on campus, as ornamental shrubs. And those are two that spread into natural areas and can really change our forest canopy structure. And we've talked to some local, or at least I've talked to some local nurseries in Amherst about those two. And it's like, they say year after year for the last 50 years, people come back and say, I saw this in my neighbor's yard, I want to plant it.
And you're freezing up a bit.
Oh no.
But dang, my internet connection doesn't seem to be great at the moment. Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, great. I think my internet's a little choppy. But okay. Thank you. And I think our audience members would also really love a list and some resources, but of like everything you're talking about, just so they know what they're getting marketed, right? What they're buying. And maybe we can do that towards the end, but can we let's go to some questions and answers from the audience. Give a little bit of time for that. So if anybody has any question and would like to raise their hand, or if they'd like to type it in, it over. Sorry about my internet.
No, that's okay. And thank you for stopping me because I can rant about this all day.
Yeah.
What proportion of non-native plants are invasive? That's a really good question and somewhat unknown, and something that two of Bethany's students, I think, are working on right now. So there's a classic hypothesis in invasion ecology called the TENS rule, where some researchers hypothesize that about 10% of species make it through each phase of the invasion. So of all the plants that are introduced, or all the invasive species that are introduced, or species that are introduced to new areas, about 10% will be able to survive the transport, so survive the cargo ship passage or whatever. And then about 10% of those are going to be able to actually establish viable populations. And then 10% of those are actually going to be able to spread. And then 10% of those are going to have impact. There is not a lot of evidence that those proportions are accurate. But there are some studies that look at about 10% or less of the non-native plant pool is known to become invasive.
That's a pretty big number.
Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, so in the United States, we have about 700 species that are government recognized as invasive. So that's either by the federal government or individual state government lists. The number is probably double that, closer to 1,000 or 1,200 species, because not all plants that are invasive are regulated. But so if you think about like how many plants we have in North America, which is not a number I know off the top of my head, and then think about, well, 1,200 of those becoming invasive. But I think the thing that's really important there is that any one invasive plant can have devastating impacts. And so although the rate 10% is pretty big, but I think in reality it's lower than that. But even so, like even one of these species can like totally wreck regional ecosystems. And so there's a lot of people in different industries who use that number as an argument for saying like, okay, well, if the proportion's small, like we're going to keep importing non-native plants all over the place. But again, like it's such a risk. No,
not worth it.
Species have done.
Definitely not worth it. Let's go to a question, somebody has their hand raised, happens to be my mom.
Ah, that's great.
So here, let's allow, unmute yourself.
Hi, I'm Liz, Sonia's mom, and I'm here with her sister Paloma.
Paloma's here. Hello.
Yeah, this is so wonderfully informative. I'm so grateful that you're on and talking about this. I actually put the question in the chat. I wanted to get an example of a non-native plant that was benign and maybe even helpful to ecosystems. And also, is there a list of those plants so that if we are thinking of, changing up our garden and adding these plants, that would be great to have that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I see other people are interested in the list. Yes, so the Massachusetts state government has a list of plants that are prohibited in the state that's intended for horticulture and other people. So that's a resource I can make sure and so pretty much most states in the United States have an official list. And I can share those resources with you, as well as, and we can talk about this a little later, but lists of native plants that are really good alternatives to the common non-natives. Mm-hmm. So yes. And then I think one of the good examples of some of the trade-offs of a plant that may be like doing one good thing and one bad thing is goldenrod. So goldenrod is a plant that can be really invasive, but pollinator people love it because it's one of the plants, that flowers late into the season. And so it's one of the, I think that's right, at least it's either late in the season or early in the season, but it's one of the few floral resources for pollinators that's still out and about. And so that's a species we typically think of as super weedy. But that's one of those things where there might be places where it's still like roadsides or ditches where we don't necessarily care about the native plants as much, or that's like a really disturbed habitat, that it might be okay to leave some goldenrod in there because it's good for the bees and stuff like that. So I think that's one that we definitely have goldenrod in Massachusetts. That's one. And then there's a couple others that are similar, like autumn olive is another one that's really bad in Massachusetts, but some birds eat the berries. And so there's like a camp of people who are like, no, for the bird, like the berries. But the reality is that a lot of these plants are not as good for native biodiversity. So if you think about like our pollinators and animals, they're used to the native ecosystem. And so when something new shows up, a lot of times herbivores won't eat it as often, pollinators won't visit them as often. It's actually worse habitat for birds as well. Non-native plants in general. And so while it may not be having, like some non-native plants may be doing nothing or not having extreme negative impact, there's a growing body of research that shows that native plants are better for ecosystem functioning and supporting native wildlife.
Great. Well, we look forward to those resources that you'll be sharing with us. Thank you so much, Eve. And we have a couple more questions, but we're gonna go back to them after our next vignette or next part of our conversation. So switching gears here a bit, not really actually. I'm interested in how climate change and invasive species are interacting. So these two very important global change drivers are important on their own, but they also have an interacting effect. And I think that you can maybe explain a little bit about that interaction.
Yeah, and maybe I can answer Robert's question in the chat as part of that, but I'll put up, let me find, I have a slide that might be helpful. It kind of goes through, here we go. So this is kind of our little cartoony version of the interactions between invasive species and climate change that we're expecting to see. And so it's pretty common that global change drivers interact. So things like land use change can promote invasions, or climate change exacerbates land use change in some areas. And so, invasive species are part of that story too. And we're seeing all kinds of different interactions that we don't know that much about yet, but we're starting to understand much better. So here are a handful of examples. So when you think about plants, we think a lot of weedy invasive plants are going to become more competitive. So higher temperatures and higher CO2 basically functions as plant food. A lot of invasive species have faster growth rates. And so if you're like feeding the fast species all the things they need to get bigger and weedier, then they end up edging out the native plants to at a faster rate than they were under kind of our normal climate conditions. We're also seeing, this is a big one I think is really scary that we don't know that much about yet, is that we're seeing herbicides become less effective. And again, this is pretty plant specific, but I think there's some evidence that it relates to insects as well.
Yeah.
So with climate change, it's changing the way that plants are interacting with air and water. And there's a lot of herbicides are absorbed through the leaves or through the roots. So there's some evidence that invasive plants are not absorbing herbicide at the same degree that they were before, which is going to require more herbicide to get rid of them. And I think I actually have, this is probably going to be hard for a lot of people to see, but this example at the bottom shows that. And so this is an example of, I think it's, Canada thistle growth under current versus higher CO2. And so it was like 1 year after herbicide treatment, and you could see under higher CO2, Canada thistle was dedicating more growth to its roots, less to its shoots. So if you sprayed herbicide on the top of the plants, it was dying, killing them in a season, but the next year they actually came back even stronger because they were storing more of their biomass below ground, growing bigger root systems because they had carbon to feed off of, essentially.
Smart plants.
Yeah. Scary though. That's a scary one that I think the field technology is we're still learning a lot about how herbicide technology is going to change. And of course, people are already scared about how much herbicide we're dumping on to natural areas. And so the idea that could have to increase is really scary.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think kind of building a little bit, kind of changing a little bit of how we're thinking about this. So within a country, we have many states and many different ecoregions. And as climate change is happening, these ecoregions are shifting. And so these ranges are shifting. And so I'm a little interested in how do we define native species or non-native species when we are having actual natural range shifts?
Yeah, and maybe I'll just start by, so Robert in the chat had asked, it seems unlikely that we'll be able to stop the spread of invasive species. Do you agree? And what are our strongest tools to prevent this? So that it's an uphill battle, and it's a field that has not that many resources, not that many people and funding, and not that many people know about, unfortunately. But one thing that we've started to do with the group at UMass that I think is really exciting is using our understanding of range shifts. And so just to reiterate what you said, as the climate changes, the area that's considered good habitat for a lot of these species is also changing. And in the US, that's changing towards New England. So New England's getting warmer. And so there's a lot of cold limited species, insects, plants, animals that are going to be able to survive here that are already invading the mid-Atlantic and the Southeast regions. And the good news is that we have really good predictive tools for guessing which species are coming. Species distribution models. So that's actually one thing I think is really exciting, because it's an area where we're leveraging information that we have about climate change to try to get ahead of the next wave of invasions. And that's where Bethany Bradley, my old advisor, and a lot of our group at UMass has spent a lot of time pushing for people to think further ahead about what's coming so that we can really prioritize preventing new species from showing up rather than trying to get rid of the ones that are already here. So that was kind of a tangent. And I think you asked.
We kind of answered a couple of questions there for us.
And so this idea of native versus non-native is tricky. And there's also a difference, I think, between species that are able to move on their own, like a range shift, just natural migration processes, versus species that humans are moving much further than they'd be able to move on their own. And so I think the lines between what's native to where and what's non-native to where are already really messy under current climate conditions, and will probably get messier as we go, which is something I can talk more about, how I think the field is maybe changing slowly, but needs to be changing to deal with that.
I guess thinking about intentionally moving plants, right? There are also some initiatives for assisted migration of natives that aren't so good at moving on their own. Do you have an example of that? Or could you maybe go into a little more detail on that?
Yeah, so like you just said, species are moving around on their own. The thing is that we're really good at moving invasive species, like I said, further than they can move naturally. So the invasive species are not going to have that much trouble keeping up with climate change, whereas a lot of our native species move a lot slower. We're not moving them around as actively. And so there are a lot of native species and populations that we should be worried about not shifting fast enough to persist. So, if they're moving northward at a slower rate than the climate is changing, which is what we're seeing in a lot of natural systems, their population sizes are going to basically get cut off as the climate changes. And there's all other kinds of reasons why these populations are not doing well. So I think I have some slides on assisted migration. Yeah, okay, so assisted migration is essentially this idea that we can help species move along to track their preferred climate and preferred habitat. This is a really big topic of conversation in conservation and ecology right now, because it's one of the few things we can actively do to help species move. But obviously, as we know from invasion ecology, there are tons of risks associated with moving species to new areas. And so I think there's kind of a battle, maybe I shouldn't call it a battle, but there's a lot of conversation in the field right now about like what the best way to do assisted migration is. Should we be doing it at all? What are the good species? Is there any chance this is going to be helpful? And so from the invasion side, my group has also thought a lot about how we can kind of take the tools from an invasion ecology to try to minimize the risks of assisted migration, which I think is what this slide is here, which is like too many words and you don't need to worry about it. But basically what we've done is we've taken traits that are common to invasive species and said like, okay, when a species shows up in a new area, if it's has really fast growth rates, it doesn't have a lot of evolutionary history with the species that are there, it's a generalist, so it can grow in a lot of different conditions or maybe interact with lots of other species, or then it's maybe more likely to have negative effects on the ecosystem that it moves into. Whereas if a species is slower growing or a keystone species that has shared evolutionary history with the other species in the community, then it's less of a risk. And so these are just kind of like things that we've learned through invasion ecology that we can try to apply to species movements and assisted migration. And so one example that I really like is of this tree from Florida. This is now one of the most threatened conifer, so needle-leaf trees that we have in the United States. It's the super rare tree that people just for whatever reason have decided they love, and it has like a little fan group. And so there was an invasive pathogen that was introduced to Florida from, like a hitchhiking on another tree that really went after this species and decimated huge numbers of its populations. And like I said, it was already rare. So it was already kind of on the brink of not having that many trees left. And so this group of scrappy citizen scientists decided that they were going to do everything that they could to save the tree. And so you can see on this map on the right, they took populations of this tree and transplanted them further north where it was still within the range of like suitable climate space that the species could survive in, and tried to see if they could save the tree. And they have been super successful in planting it in botanical gardens and keeping it alive. And so, yeah, so that's super exciting. I mean, this is one of the, I think, super successful stories of assisted migration where there's a reason that we want to keep a species around, and people have been able to do that. But this was a really low risk move because this is like I said, a super rare tree. It's very slow growing. You can see this picture of this woman standing next to it. It's massive. It's not like, it's not going to become invasive. And so
not going to go running anywhere.
Yeah, it's not going to be, going crazy. So, the risks associated with moving the species were really low. And then on the other hand, we have the story of black locust, which is an invasive tree in New England. This map in the middle is actually showing you the native range of this tree. So this is where it naturally evolved, historically evolved. And you can see it's not that far away, right? It's like central Pennsylvania. Like that's like not far away from New England, not super different ecosystems. You might think like, okay, no big deal. Let's plant it in New England, which is exactly what we did. And even that jump from central Pennsylvania to Massachusetts, planting a species as an ornamental outside of its range, black locust was able to escape cultivation. It's now a very disturbance responsive species. It's changing nutrient cycling in a bunch of different ecosystems and out competing with other plants and facilitating other invasives. So it's just become a total mess. And this is one where we had, we knew that it was an early successional species, which means it's one of the first things, if you like mess up the soil or cause some disturbance or rip out another tree, this is one of the first things to take root. Nitrogen fixer, which is a really common trait of invasives, which is not important to take away from that. But again, it's another trait that we associate with invasives that we knew
Yeah.
about before we moved it, and we still moved it. And the outcome was that this thing is a like nightmare to get out of natural areas now.
Yeah.
I think this is another good example of that, like native versus non-native. Like this was a relatively small jump. Like a lot of our major invasive species we have here from like China and Japan.
Right.
And this is from central Pennsylvania, and now is invasive. It's on
right next door.
Yeah, so it's on the Massachusetts list of regulated invasive plants, and I think a handful of the other New England states is like it's become a real management nightmare. So this is one where it's like a smaller range of assisted migration, but because we deliberately moved it outside of where we know it historically evolved, it spread and became really nasty. So
I'm hearing you say a lot of we move things, and I don't think you necessarily mean you or us, but I think for our Life Science Cafe audience, we talk a lot about science, but I think it is so important for us to understand the policies and who are making these kind of entire ecosystems. And I know you have a bit of experience interacting with policymakers. So I'm just kind of wondering what you know about like the regulation around these sorts of practices and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I know a lot about the regulations around preventing invasive species, not as much about what's going on with moving native species, but like this black locust example is one where that was horticulture, like that was industry. Imported this plant, the tree, and moved it. And then, so let me back up for a second. Like I said, there's a list of invasive plants for pretty much every US state. There's also a federal government list of about 100 species that that basically identifies plants that we don't want planted anywhere, and they shouldn't be moved around either within the state or across state borders.
Right.
The issue is that, like, as you can see through this range map, like black locust is covering, spanning a lot of state borders. And if you move it outside of a state, like it's a totally different ballgame. Our regulations on prohibiting invasive plants are all very state specific. And some of my research has found that there's shockingly low overlap in what each state considers invasive and on their do not plant list. So we looked at the identity of the regulated invasive plants across the US, and on average, neighboring states share less than 20% of their species. So that's crazy. Like if you think about a region like New England, Connecticut, and Massachusetts, and Vermont, like there's not that much different going on.
Small states.
They're small states. They're really close together. They've got really similar forest types. Like why are their priorities with invasives so different? And so that's something that we've been working really hard on in the Northeast to try to change. There's like a billion reasons why that people come up with for why the lists are so different. Some are good and some don't make any sense at all. But it's unfortunately one of the consequences of having this like state-centric system where states are kind of left to their own devices. There's not a lot of shared resources, but when it comes to something like this, like we're moving species at more of a regional basis. And so if states aren't coordinating their regulations, it leaves a lot of like open opportunities to move things around. So that's one part of it. And then the other part of it is that we also found, we were trying to understand like how equipped these regulations are for dealing with some of these climate range shifting species. So the species that are really invasive in New Jersey that could become present in Massachusetts in the next 10 to 20 years. And we found that most of the invasive plant regulations in the US are super reactive, which means that like the black locust example, all right, let's plant it. Seems like a good idea.
Yeah.
Several years later, we see it showing up. People are noticing it show up in natural areas. They want to get it removed. It's really hard to get out. It's affecting the native plant communities, so on. And then it gets added to the state regulatory list. So a lot of those decisions are happening once something's already able to spread or has already spread. And we already have good evidence that like, all right, it's here, it's bad. Let's add it to the list so nobody plants it anymore. But like that reactive approach is really not effective for preventing anything from showing up. And our resources are much better spent on preventing things from showing up to new areas than like trying to weed them out once they're already here. And so the regulatory framework for invasive plants needs a ton of work. And we've been pushing hard on that in the Northeast, and actually I think making a lot of progress to get the Northeast states on the same page about what they're doing. Which is great and exciting. And also with the climate we have like lists of basically like a watch list of species to look out for, which I can share that as well. And
That'd be
that's
great.
yeah, some of the New England states are starting to take more seriously in terms of like, all right, well, we can't like tell like, how can we like get nurseries and get people to learn about these species now so that they're not like planting them in their gardens before they become, before we have we have a chance to prevent them from showing up here before they really start to spread. So that's where a lot of like my focus and the UMass group's focus has been in the last couple of years with working on the regulatory stuff. And then the native plant assisted migration, I don't know what we're going to do about that.
Yeah.
It's hard to get a sense for how often that's already happening. But one thing I pushed for is thinking about gardens as tools for assisted migration, and maybe I'll pause, see where we are in time.
I think we can pause here. I have a lot of questions, but I think we should give some time for the audience to ask some questions. Okay, right. So here's your first question from Anon. You've mentioned that states have specific regulations. Does this mean we can feel safe buying plants at local stores or big box stores as long as you're within your state? Basically, can we trust the stores not to sell invasives, or should we be checking on our own?
That's a really hard question. I would say in Massachusetts, we do a much better job than other places at having an up-to-date list of invasive plants and a good regulatory body that tries to make sure that our nurseries aren't selling them. But some of that research I mentioned earlier that found that more than half of our invasive plants are still sold as ornamentals also found several hundred cases of invasive plants being sold by a nursery or an individual, even though it was on the regulatory list. And so unfortunately, these regulatory bodies, so here's an example of Amherst nurseries. Like, we went and talked to Winzik, and so people who are local will know these places, Winzik and Hadley Garden Center, and about this issue. And they said, yeah, Mass is really great. Like, they send someone around once a summer, check our inventory, make sure we're not like pouring herbicide into the rivers, and like that our native plant, like our stock is consistent with the regulatory list, which is really awesome. And like, you would expect that to be the bare minimum. And it's like, unfortunately not happening everywhere that effectively, but Mass is doing a great job. But the flip side of that is that they said, like, I'm getting like 5 trucks of plants from New Jersey shipped here like every week. And so like that regulatory capacity does not nearly match the volume of trade that's happening, most of which is happening across state borders where we're shipping plants in from further south. And so I think Mass is doing a really good job and better than some, but not all invasive plants that I think should be considered invasive in New England are going to be on the Mass regulatory list.
Asking Massachusetts for everyone who's not from Massachusetts.
Yeah. So, but I will say, like, my opinion, and this is easier said than done, but is to always try to ask your grower, like, go to a nursery and ask them for native stock. Like, that is the safest bet if you're getting new stuff. They'll know what that means. A lot of nurseries I've been kind of surprised at how they're super knowledgeable about the issue of invasives in Massachusetts, and don't want to be doing harm intentionally. And so if you go to like these nurseries and say, like, I want a native garden, a native pollinator garden, any kind of native plants, I want to prioritize that. We have tons of native alternatives to common non-native plants. That's a resource. And that's just like a really easy way to avoid like a risky situation.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So our next question from Linda: by assisted range expansion, do you mean moving trees into areas that will eventually become their natural range, i.e. moving sugar maples north so that they can still exist when they can't live here anymore?
Yeah, so I guess I didn't really talk about this slide, but this is kind of the little diagram of different kind of distances of assisted migration. The riskiest move is when you're taking species. So if you think of this like bottom orange circle as a species native range, if you're moving something outside of the native range, it can be really risky. But I think this first circle is really where we want to be hanging out, which is taking species from the southern part of their range and moving them to the northern part of their range. So within an area where we already know they exist, they are doing well, this northern range is only going to get more suitable. And so it's kind of like helping,
you're like packing them.
Yeah, like helping them step
Right.
along without like totally like picking them up and moving them over here. And the climate is changing fast enough that I think like we have a lot of room to work with on that northern range margin. So wait, I think I have another nice figure that could. Yeah, okay. So this is for the plant people in the audience, gardeners, you'll be familiar with hardiness.
Ooh.
Yeah, so these are essentially maps of grow zones. And so each plant that is common in horticulture is associated with this scale for what temperature range it grows in. And so this is a prediction for how hardiness zones are changing in the Northeast. And so you can see there's a major shift from these like 3, 4, 5 ranges to be more like 4, 5, 6 hardiness zones. And so there's a ton of plants that can live, from 3 to 6. And so the idea is to try to plant species or prioritize species that have their northern range limits in New England, but like are really doing well in that 5 or 6 range. And so that we can think about increasing their abundance through gardening to try to help them move along without doing something crazy like picking them up and planting them super far north. And I think people are still doing that on a risk-based approach. So for low risk species, like the sugar maples is a great example of a species that we really love and is really important to our economy in the Northeast, that we want to do our best to keep around. But on kind of a more regular basis, I think sticking in this like assisted migration bubble of moving things to where they already have suitable habitat that will only get more suitable with time, if that makes sense.
Right. Okay, well, thank you. That was incredibly informative, Dr. Beaury.
We're running out of time already.
Well, I know, I was gonna say 10 minutes. So I think we're gonna move on to our next set of questions. And I want to do a range shift into what you're doing at Princeton. Sorry. And I think your work now is not so much focused on invasive species, but focused on climate mitigation solutions. And so I would love for you to explain within 10 minutes what climate mitigation strategies look like.
Yeah, that's good because I only have been at this job for like a month or two. So 10 minutes is probably all I need to.
Perfect.
The extent of my knowledge. But what I'll say quickly though, is that like, I think there's a lot of really awesome questions in the chat. And I'll make sure I follow up with the Science Cafe people to make sure that some of the resources I've mentioned get out to the listserv, and we can save, like, we'll make sure we save the chat so I can like type in some answers either at the end or shoot those out over email, because I think there's some really good questions in there.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. Climate mitigation. So, okay. So here's one of the resources I mentioned that's like native plant gardening. So I left UMass kind of feeling like I really like working on these drivers of global change, drivers of native biodiversity loss. I love thinking about invasive species. I think they're really interesting and scary to think about. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But I was kind of at the point where I was like, all right, well, I could stay in invasions, try to scale down, think of something more on the ground or species specific, or stay kind of in the big data world, but try to focus more on climate change, which is where I'm headed in this position that I have now. And so the general idea that I'm working with is that there's a bunch of different ways that you can change the landscape to try to store more carbon. So this is just, there's like way too much going on in this figure, but essentially we have these different projections for what the carbon concentration of the Earth's atmosphere is going to be in the future. And we're doing our best to keep warming at 2 degrees Celsius or below. And there's a bunch of different strategies that we have for either reducing our emissions, so like stop driving, do other things. But also there's a bunch of ways that we can try to capture and store more carbon in the long term. And that's what these climate mitigation strategies are trying to do. So it's basically a way that we can change the landscape to store more carbon. And so here are like some of the really obvious examples. The biggest one that I'm sure everybody's familiar with is just planting trees. So planting trees stores more carbon, keeps the nutrient cycling, stores carbon in the soil and in the biomass of the trees. So that's considered a natural climate solution or a land-based climate mitigation strategy.
Nice.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, that was it. Go, you please continue.
Yeah. So, okay. So reforestation for planting trees, that's a great one. One of the other things that I think I've been thinking a lot about recently is bioenergy crops. So these are like fast growing grass species typically, or short rotation trees that we can actually produce sustainable sources of energy. They're also cool because they store carbon in the biomass, and they also, there's technology that we're developing to try to capture the carbon that the plants are fixing and then storing it in the soil, which is basically what's going on here. So that's another one. And then, reforestation, afforestation, which the difference there is just that reforestation is planting trees where we knew there was once forest. Afforestation is planting trees anywhere we want to plant a tree, even if there was never a forest there in Earth's history, then why not? And then the last one on this list is changing our agricultural practices to try to store more carbon. And so that's things like row cropping. So, in between your rows of crops that you really care about, plant some other plant that's good for storing carbon, and all kinds of other things like pollinators. And then changing things like plantation forestry, like timber harvest, so that we're maximizing our carbon storage. And so there's a bunch of different things that we can do to change the land to store more carbon. Which all seems really exciting. It's really cool. We're kind of leveraging these natural processes of the earth, like planting trees and carbon nutrient cycling. But one thing that's been really missing from the plans to do all of these things is thinking about what the impact to natural ecosystems and biodiversity is. And
right,
so
there's definitely some trade-offs with
So
trees.
One of the spatial trade-offs that we've been thinking a lot about lately is kind of these two in the middle. So if you have like a degraded landscape, or just think about like all the leftover land that's not being used for something right now, we have this decision between planting a tree, trying to reestablish forests, which is really great for biodiversity in some cases and not so great in other cases, or like, do we plant a bioenergy crop field, which is going to store more carbon in the short term and produce energy and maybe be good for the economy, whereas the forest is going to be better for biodiversity. And so thinking about some of these trade-offs, both in terms of their impact on biodiversity and where they overlap in space across the earth, is where my project at Princeton is headed. Which that was a lot of information, but yeah, that's
I think it's great. I think you're highlighting. I think like we kind of have to be using all of these strategies at the same time because we are at such a critical point. And I think that understanding their like relative trade-off between these strategies is incredibly important. And I think you're mostly focusing on carbon capture and biofuels. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, kind of looking at the suite of options that we have and understanding what the trade-offs are for biodiversity. So like another example is afforestation, which is planting trees where we didn't historically have trees. That's really good for carbon storage, but there's actually been some research that has found that planting trees everywhere is not actually good for biodiversity. Like there's some really valuable ecosystems that are not forests. And if we go in and plant a bunch of trees, it actually screws up what's already there. So that's another kind of example of like, thinking about this menu of options that we have for changing the land to store more carbon, and then how that overlaps with where we want to be prioritizing biodiversity, and trying to understand like where we should be putting, where we should be changing our forest management versus where we should be planting a bioenergy field, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think also planting a bunch of trees need a lot of water. And water is one of those other very limiting resources. So I think that has a pretty big trade-off and something that we need to really consider.
Bioenergy uses a ton of water also, and like more nutrients and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, there are a lot of trade-offs. And I think the problem is that, the reason I got hired to do this project is that there are trade-offs like water and food security and things like that have been considered, but the biodiversity angle hasn't been prioritized enough in these climate mitigation plans. Like people are really excited about trying to figure out how to mitigate climate change and store more carbon, but that can't come at the expense of like cutting down, changing the landscape to the point where it's screwing up everything that was already there.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I think that was a ton of information. I want to kind of close and maybe have one more moment for people to kind of ask you a couple of questions if they'd like that. But we, as Life Science Cafe, we like to kind of end by bringing awareness to the importance of diversity in science, and diversity of thought, experiences, and perspectives. And so, just to end on a high note, in your experience, are there any diversity efforts that you'd like to highlight? Kind of maybe at UMass, or what has that been like for you?
Yeah, I think I'm in kind of an interesting position, having just changed job titles and university systems. I think I want to just like do a huge shout out to Amherst, who I think following the death of George Floyd took diversity, equity, and inclusion issues really seriously and seemed to still be pushing in a direction of having more equitable and accessible science programs that are inclusive for different types of groups. And I think the grad students have a really amazing role in that. And that was something that I cared a lot about as a grad student. And I think a lot of grad students care about, and there's faculty that care about it too, but it's a lot of times pushed by the grad students. So in the job I have now, I'm a postdoc, which is kind of like a stepping stone between a grad student and a faculty position. And I think at a lot of universities, Princeton included, there's like not really a clear place where we fit in. Like we're not here for very long. There's not as much buy-in there. Like it's hard to really make change in a short amount of time. And so I think one of the things I've been struggling with is like how, as an early career person that cares about these issues, like where do I fit in a place where I'm going to be for 2 years, and that already has things going on. So I don't know, but I guess we're running out of time, but I'll just briefly say one of the most interesting shifts I think has been the kind of culture at UMass versus the culture at Princeton. Obviously, Princeton is an amazing institution with a lot of money and a lot of people that are willing to put money behind things. And I think as far as the graduate school goes, I think the issue of equity has become something that I care a lot more about now, coming from a place like UMass, where we had a union that was constantly fighting for raises and fellowship status and all kinds of issues, and seeing people like not be able to save a ton of money in grad school, or like feel like they had a livable wage or could travel or do things that like they wanted to do. And then coming to a place like Princeton, where the grad students here just got a major raise to be like making almost as much money as postdocs at other places and here. And so like having a program that's funded, an ecology program that's funded so well, really changes the tone for how things go. And I think the capacity for graduate students to work on and care about other things. And I think that inequity is not something I knew about it, but didn't experience firsthand. Now seeing that shift between a place like UMass and a place like Princeton is kind of pretty striking. And now I think like, of the diversity, equity, inclusion umbrella, like equity is something that I'm going to think a lot about when I hopefully get a job somewhere next. Who knows what kind of institution it'll be, but
I'm sure they get a job.
Yeah, let's hope. But seeing the disparity and like how much having a well-funded ecology program can like do a lot of good. And like we see this in invasive species too. I have some research that shows that like the number one barrier, or the top two barriers to having successful invasive species management, is funding and personnel. And so like having a field that matters so much, but is like super resource limited, and having that graduate students and the type of science that happens is something that's been on my mind a lot in the last 2 months of being at Princeton. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
Well, diversity of experiences you're having for sure. I know you have to head out. Do you have time for one more question, or should we kind of shoot it to email?
No, I can answer it. Yeah, I can stick around for more questions. How does bioenergy work? I don't know if I can answer that one.
That was it.
Yeah. So how does bioenergy work? I don't know. Some chemists. So basically the bioenergy crops that I'm thinking of are things like you can make bioenergy from corn. It's basically like the byproducts that we're not using from food. We like mash up and burn essentially to make fuel. So there's still like emissions and carbon emitted from producing biofuel and diesel and things like that. There's a lot of push lately for things like grasses. Like there's a grass called miscanthus that's actually invasive in some places, and like bamboo. It's just like really tall, fast growing grasses that then we harvest and extract energy from, essentially. And so the idea is that like these crops could be annuals, and so they're growing every year. We're harvesting the biomass, we're turning that, instead of like wasting that biomass, we're turning it into a sustainable energy source. And as part of that process, we're pulling some of the carbon out and storing it in the soil. So unfortunately, that's the extent of my knowledge so far. I just know where we can be putting bioenergy. I don't know how the bioenergy actually functions. That's something I should probably learn when I've been here for a bit longer. But yeah, I think the gist of it is it's like planting crops, processing them, and extracting energy out of them.
Okay, well, next time when we invite you back, we'll be expecting.
Yeah, I'll be the bioenergy expert by the time. Yeah, give me another couple of months of reading about climate change mitigation, and then maybe I'll get somewhere.
The nitty gritty. Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Beaury, Eve. Thank you so much for coming and speaking with us today. And thank you, all of you audience members. Look out for our emails for our next event with Dr. Jeff Podos, who was our first ever Life Science Cafe speaker 10 years ago, as we continue to celebrate our 10-year anniversary with the Life Science Cafe. Also, our next cafe, which is not the next month, but the one after, will be presenting our very first cafe, de Ciencias Biológicas, Life Science Cafe en Español, in Spanish. This cafe is a collaboration between UMass and the UMass Sacknish chapter and Life Science Cafe, as we kind of work towards increasing representation and bringing science to our incredibly diverse community. We'll be exploring the world of native bee ecology and bee disease dynamics with Dr. Laura Figueroa. And if you don't speak English, if you don't speak English, it's okay. If you don't speak Spanish, we'll also have the option of live interpretation to English during our talk. So get ready for that one. So don't forget to register as we talk to Dr. Podos next month about birds, and Dr. Laura Figueroa the month after about bees. Check out our website. I think we're going to put it in the chat. Check out our website, oebsciencecafe.org. And if you haven't already, please don't forget to fill out our virtual sign-in sheet so we can continue to bring you cafes on the topics you would like to hear about. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Have a good evening, everybody.